Hello and welcome everybody to ICAST 2020 Online Conservation Seminar Series. My name is Mike Wayne. I am the American Sport Fishing Association's Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director. And I'm joined today by Dr. Mike Armstrong, who's the Assistant Director for Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, and Kevin Blinkoff, the Executive Editor of On the Water. And we're here to talk about rebuilding the iconic Atlantic striped bass fishery. Gentlemen, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Mike?
Great. I'm excited to talk about this topic, having just been in Nantucket catching some striped bass myself. So this was top of mind, and I felt like ICAST 2020 Online was a good opportunity to talk about striped bass and all the things that have been going on. So I think just to get us started here, Kevin, why don't you, On the Water does Striper Cup. You guys have been doing that for a long time, big fishing tournament for striped bass in New England. And I just wanted to give everybody tuning in a better understanding of how the fishery has gone over the last several years and any trends that you've been seeing on the water. Especially as you guys have put on that tournament, and I know everyone looks forward to it and gets excited to go out there and catch striped bass. So what have you guys been seeing over the last several years?
Yeah, and I can step even a little further back to when On the Water started in 1996, and we really started on the back of the rebuilt striper population. So that was when striped bass recovered. There were a lot of fish in the population, especially smaller fish. And we saw a big boom in light tackle, fly rod fishing for striped bass, and that's really what led On the Water to be able to grow and exist. The Striper Cup tournament we started in 2006, about 10 years later, and at that time there were a lot of big fish in the population, and there was a renewed interest in this sort of in resurrecting a trophy fishery for striped bass. We designed the tournament back then based on the old Schaefer Cup tournament, which was in the 60s and 70s. And the idea was to mimic that, which was very much about keeping as many big striped bass as possible, with a tournament that reflected the new conservation ethos that we saw in striper fishermen. So when the Striper Cup started, again, now that was 14 years ago, we had what we thought of as very conservative rules. Each fisherman could only keep 2 fish, each club would only weigh in 10 fish. And at the time, like I said, it was considered conservation minded. Over the past 10, 14 years, what we've really seen is a shift in angler attitudes. And fishermen now are looking more toward catch and release. They especially didn't want to keep the bigger fish, what they refer to as the breeders or the spawning size fish. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we made a big shift in the tournament from weighing in striped bass to making it more of a catch and release tournament, to where it's now 100% catch and release, and it really is bigger than it's ever been before. We've got over 5,000 anglers that participate in the tournament. They come to our Striper Cup event, the Striper Fest, and for them it really is about catching big striped bass, getting a picture, and letting those fish go. And as far as how it's seen, how it's reflected, that's sort of more about angler attitudes. The fishery itself, we've really seen it kind of parallel what we've heard from managers. 4 or 5 years ago, we started to hear a lot of concern from fishermen about having fewer big fish in the population. And now, with new rules and regulations coming into play and people more concerned about conservation and catch and release, hopefully we'll see that start to reverse and start to see more big fish come back into the population.
Perfect. Well, that's a great segue for us to bring in Dr. Armstrong, who just is outgoing chair for the Atlantic Striped Bass Board at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So let me paint a picture here. Mike, over the last 2 years, has been guiding all of the commissioners that sit around the management table on striped bass, especially as they responded to some recent science about the stock being overfished and experiencing overfishing. And so, Mike, tell us about what that experience was like over the last 2 years trying to navigate what was some bumpy waters for sure.
Sure. striped bass is always one of the more pleasurable species to try and manage, because for every angler, there's another interest in how you want it managed. And from north to south, we have very different interests. The Bay, like, they fish on little fish, we fish on big fish. So trying to come to a consensus in a management regime is very difficult. But we did it. We got the amendment, the addendum finished. We got the slot size put in. So we accomplished a lot, and we think we're poised to bring this stock back. But it's not easy, and it won't be without bumps in the road going forward either.
So Mike, when you say bring it back, I'm going to pull up a figure of spawning stock biomass just to give everybody a visual of where we're at here. And assuming you guys can see, let me show my screen real quick. So I'm showing the SSB figure here, and can you just talk everybody through kind of where we are now relative to where we were back in the 1980s, as Kevin referenced, sort of the rebuild period, and where we're headed to in terms of where do we need to get to rebuild the stock?
Sure. So starting in the late 70s, we started seeing the erosion of SSB. SSB being spawning stock biomass, the weight of mature females. It's the best measure of the health of the stock and the reproductive capacity. So the stock went down hard in the 1980s, and you can see the tail end of when we started a quantitative assessment back in '82. We were at probably 15% of where we want to be now. Through pretty draconian measures, we brought it back, and in 1995 it was declared restored. And since then we've waggled along up and down. And in recent years, the latest assessment shows SSB has been eroding again, to the point the last assessment determined that we are overfished and overfishing is occurring. The difference is, and we hear a lot of panic out of people, back in the 70s, there were no guidelines of what managers had to do. We are under strict guidelines. As soon as the stock gets under that dotted line, we have to react. Now, why it took so long is a different story we'll talk about in a little bit. But we're at about 70% of where we want to be, as opposed to 15%. So there's no imminent stock collapse. And in fact, we're in decent shape. Are there the amount of big fish people want around? Absolutely not, because the stock is at a lower level right now. But we're beginning to rebuild.
Yeah, so Mike, the other thing I wanted to highlight on this figure is you talked a lot about SSB, which is the blue shaded area showing the decline in the 1980s, increasing over the mid-2000s, and then the recent decline from the mid-2000s to until now. But the other part of this figure is recruitment, which I like to refer as baby striped bass that are that we track through surveys. And we can see that we've had strong year classes. There was one in 2011, and I think 14 and 15 were strong year classes as well. And so can you talk a little bit about how important those year classes are to SSB and what that relationship means for striped bass?
Sure. Recruitment in striped bass is highly variable, and that's predictable. When you have an animal that lives 25, 30 years and puts out 3 million years in eggs, that's prima facie evidence that they have highly variable recruitment, because they have to bet hedge across years. So if you look at an individual stanza, say the last 3 years and 4 years of this graph, out of the same SSB, we get a record low, a near record high, and a bunch of mediums. And that's the way it works. And so when you have a series of low, which we did in 2006, 7, 8, 9, around there, up till 2011, When that projects forward into adulthood for females, which is about 7, 8+ years, we start seeing SSB eroding. And that's exactly what has caused the erosion of SSB, is those poor year classes. That being said, you see they came out of a lot of biomass. Why is that? Because it's primarily not fishing. It's primarily environmental causes. And the biggest known cause is sort of the water regime within Chesapeake Bay. When you have flood springs, you get bad recruitment. When you get really dry springs, you get bad recruitment. When you get a nice, cool, wettish spring, you get big year classes. The exact mechanism isn't known, but we do know that much. So it's always going to be highly variable. And so we want to avoid trying to chase our tail, which means we have to husband the big year classes along the best we can. The only way to do that is to keep F low.
Yeah, so the board, through your leadership, has taken steps to reduce fishing mortality to the target. And there's been a lot of questions from, and Kevin, you can probably back me up on this, from the angling community about this idea of rebuilding striped bass from where it's at to where we want it to be, which is from a scientific standpoint to this solid line for now. And so ultimately my question is, how does the management board actually rebuild striped bass? What can they control and what can't they control? You just said, you know, we don't have any control over recruitment, but we can control how many, what our fishing mortality is, and provide enough SSB to get high levels of recruitment. But functionally, what is the management board doing when they take reductions in the striped bass fishery?
So there's really only one way to rebuild stocks. You're right, we can't cause good recruitment. It's mostly environmentally induced. The only thing we can control is fishing mortality, which is somewhere in the same magnitude as natural mortality. So we can cut that down to a level that the projections show we will build. And so we overcome natural mortality. And we did that. So we've taken criticism that the management plan says we have to cut F to the target F in 1 year. We did that. We're targeting 0.2 from 0.31. That will be accomplished this year. At least that's what the projections show. So we're already starting rebuilding. Cutting F is the only way to rebuild. Now, we'll take a look at it every year going forward and do projections. And if at any point it looks like we're not going to keep rebuilding, then we'll have to adjust F even lower. So we're on the way.
Yeah, this is not a set it and forget it scenario. The management board will continue to monitor the progress of this fishery, and will make adjustments as needed to address any changes that they see that they didn't expect. And I think that's the way management has gone, and it sounds like that's where it's headed. You guys are already working on sort of the next steps for management. Can you talk a little bit about that, Mike?
Sure, we'll continue to monitor through an assessment every 2 or 3 years. It's probably the most assessed species on the East Coast, at least. And of course, there's also 10 million sets of eyes monitoring the fishery all the time. And we hear from folks all the time about it.
And you want to.
And we absolutely want to. And it's a good quantitative assessment. It's age-based, so we age thousands and thousands of scales and otoliths from the fish. So it's a good assessment. So going forward, we've cut the harvest, and now the big next step, which Massachusetts we've already done, is to decrease the release mortality. And so ASMFC, part of the new addendum, has made circle hooks mandatory starting next year. We had already started that path in Massachusetts, and so we started mandatory circle hooks this year. The rest of the states will be joining us next year. And it's hard to quantify the effect. All we know is it will be positive. We don't really know how many people use circle hooks now compared to 100% next year. So that makes it tough to quantify the benefits. Other than we know it's going to be good for the stock.
Yeah, so Mike, that's perfect because I pulled this figure as well from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission website, and it shows the landings in the striped bass fishery. And so just to orient people, on this axis here is landings, and on this axis is time by year. And these tan bars are the recreational release mortality. So in the striped bass fishery, there's a 9% release mortality that's used, which is based on a scientific study where basically 1 out of every 10 fish released dies, and that's what the cumulative number of released fish is what this figure shows in terms of dead discards. So as Mike said, there's been a move towards trying to address this recreational release mortality because we've got a lot of anglers that like the experience of catching a striped bass and they release it, and we've got a really restrictive take slot limit in this fishery. So there's a lot of fish that fall outside of that slot now and need to be released by law. So minimizing release mortality is critically important for the conservation of the striped bass resource. And we can see that, that the magnitude of these tan bars here is pretty significant, especially when you look at the blue horizontal bar, or excuse me, vertical bars, which represent the fish that are actually taken home as part of a bag limit. So these released fish are making up a significant amount of mortality. And so to address that, I'd like to bring in Kevin and have him talk a little bit about the recent things that we've been working on to try to help engage the recreational fishing community, especially the striped bass anglers, on the use of circle hooks and addressing this release mortality. Mm-hmm. And I'd be happy to, I'll pull up some, hold on one second, I'll pull up some of the figures, but I want to turn it over to you to talk some more about that.
Sure, it's something that fishermen, especially striped bass fishermen, have really become aware of the importance of proper handling and helping fish survive catch and release. And this is something that we started. This was back in 2012 or 2013. John Tiedemann at Monmouth University started a program where he put together some of the best practices to help striped bass survive catch and release. From that paper that he wrote, from an article he did in our magazine, we produced this one-pager that we have distributed both through our Striper Cup tournaments to our readers, and we made it available online so that fishing clubs can print it out and distribute it, or distribute it digitally. And we've really seen, through these types of efforts of outreach, there's a lot more awareness now with striped bass fishermen that realize it's not just about going after someone keeping a fish, or it's not just about what commercial fishermen are doing, that we have to look at ourselves, we have to look at everything we do and realize that if about 9% or 1 in 10 of striped bass that are caught do not survive being released, then that's something that we want to work on. And so, thinking in terms also for tackle manufacturers, we've really seen the ones who understand that and understand that mentality with striper fishing in the Northeast have had some very good success in marketing products to anglers who want to catch and release fish, who want to do things in a way that are going to help striped bass survive.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just on that point, Mike, you guys, Massachusetts was the first state to implement this circle hook requirement. How has that gone? It's still pretty early. It's only July 8th, but that represents a pretty significant change where if you're using natural or cut bait in the striped bass fishery, you've got to use a circle hook now. And so what reports are you hearing from the water, either Kevin or Mike, in terms of how this transition is going?
Well, Kevin may have a better handle. We haven't heard a lot of complaints. When we did outreach this winter, a lot of people said they use them already. But when people see the graph you just presented, we realize we're at a crossroads here. We can only do so much as managers to control the harvest. We need to start working to reduce that release mortality, which is as much as the harvest. And that's that varies state to state. In Massachusetts, because we're a catch and release fishery, the amount of mortality from catch and release is 3 to 4 times higher than the amount we take home. And that'll vary between different states. So that's why we moved forward with the circle hooks before the other states. We realize it's a tremendous problem. And there's no blame to go around. It's part of fishing, that fish will die from foul hooking and deep hooking, things like that. But as outlined here on this great graphic and use of circle hooks, we can get that number down. But it's going to be a combination of gear type and behavior and how you handle the fish, how you release the fish. That was the long answer.
No, that's perfect. And Kevin, I'll put up the circle hook guide, just sort of help you talk through things that On the Water and Keep America Fishing and Mass DMF are doing to help inform anglers about this new requirement.
Right, and I also want to add, I mean, Mike just said how this winter, when you started introducing circle hooks, a lot of anglers said they already use them. And a big part of that is because Massachusetts DMF has been promoting that circle hooks save striped bass for many years now. And we've been trying to get that message out as well. So even though this is the first year that they are required, we've really been promoting them, and Massachusetts has been promoting them to striped bass fishermen for a while. So there are a lot of fishermen who are already voluntarily using them, which is a good thing. And what we're trying to do now is to get everyone on board. And so much of it is education and outreach, making them both aware of the fact that it's required, and then also how to use them so that they work well. And there's a lot of opportunities here, I think, for tackle manufacturers to join in on that and make sure that they're producing circle hooks that fit the regulations, and also helping out also with that education and outreach and helping fishermen know which circle hooks, which size, which types are best for striped bass. And so that's part of what we're doing here with this one pager that we've developed, working with Keep America Fishing, is put together something that can help do some education and outreach, can help people understand what circle hooks are, how to use them, and how to find success using them.
No, that's perfect. And one thing that we want to make clear to everybody tuning in is that we're trying to make these products widely available, so that people are educated and informed about how to use circle hooks and exactly the techniques that go along with that. I know I've been using circle hooks for a while in various fisheries, but when I first started out, it was really hard. And I didn't fully understand the techniques involved there. So there is a learning curve, but as Mike Armstrong said, we know the effect is going to be positive if we are gut hooking less of these fish and get some of that release mortality under control. That will definitely benefit the fishery and our resource that obviously needs some rebuilding. And so, Kevin, I just wanted to prompt you to put a plug in that we're making this available to other states as they start to think about what their implementation plans will look like to roll this out. Because as Mike Armstrong said, Massachusetts is the first, but Massachusetts is not the only state that participates in the striped bass fishery. And so we've got all the other states from Maine through North Carolina that will be implementing this requirement. And we wanted to make educational information and outreach available to all of them so that we can reach as many anglers as we can. And so, Kevin, there's also some videos that go along with this. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Right, so we've also put together some videos. We made a Massachusetts-based video first, obviously, because like you said, they are the first state right now, making this required. As this moves forward, we plan to make slightly different videos for other states because fishing is so regional. Even though we're talking striped bass, the bait used down in Chesapeake is going to be a spot, whereas up here it's going to be more menhaden and mackerel. So state by state, you start to see anglers that have different techniques and may have different needs from a circle hook. So that's our idea, is to be able to create materials that are a little more regional, state by state basis, that really speak to those anglers and educate them on how to use a circle hook, because we want them to find success. And kind of taking a step back, I mean, we see that bar graph that shows how many fish die from release mortality. And on one hand, it's, you know, it's waste, and we want to see that decreased. But the other side of that story is, if that's 9%, you know, you think about this, the number of fish that are caught and released in this fishery is a really positive story. It's really great to know that there are that many fish being caught and released. What a big popular fishery that is. And so tying this all together, if we can reduce that mortality number, but still maintain a really strong catch and release fishery where people are having success, they're enjoying the fact that they're having a lot of action and there's an abundance of fish, then it's the win all around.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And this fishery does vary across the geographic range. We know about our Chesapeake Bay anglers, just like our New England anglers. And even though they target a slightly different size class of striped bass, they're still using bait to do it. And they'll be using, and have been actually using, circle hooks
Right.
as part of their program already. But this will be a much broader rollout. So gentlemen, I just want to open up the question. We talked a lot about education and outreach in terms of how to get this circle hook message out there, but are there other suggestions that you guys have for the tackle industry and how best to help roll out the circle hook requirement and put the right gear into the angler's hands?
Sure, I'll jump in with a few lessons we've learned. We have met with some resistance, maybe, you know, from the bigger box stores, which have, you know, harder, more strict purchasing guidelines for their in-house staff. So industry needs to come around and in-store promote the circle hook. And I would love to see an angler, you know, a cutout of an angler and a striped bass with a bunch of circle hooks hanging around, different varieties, saying, save a bass, use a circle hook. Because most anglers, the casual angler, are not informed about it at all. And they'll stand in front of a display of 500 hooks and they'll hear they need circle hooks. But I've done it. It's sometimes hard to find the ones you need. And there are subtle differences. You have the octopus circles, you got short shank, thick shank, wide gap. In all honesty, we don't know if they all work the same. And we're starting research on that. And it'll take a few years to get to that. So we want to work with the manufacturers so that they start building and promoting the most conservation directed hook. And it may not be what you're making now, but I can't tell you that.
Mike, I think you're absolutely right, and that's one, you know, sort of a general comment about the tackle industry is sometimes we make it too complicated, and there really are opportunities here, I think, to you know, especially at this time right now with COVID, we're seeing a huge number of people coming into fishing. We're seeing more kind of entry-level fishermen than ever before, and so across all tackle we produce, the more that we can educate and make it easy for novice anglers in this fishery to know what gear to buy and how to use it, it's going to help them be successful, and it's also going to help them embrace conservation measures like using the circle hooks. Part of that's my job and our job in the media to educate and do outreach, but it is also something that on the tackle manufacturer side, I think could play a big role. And another aspect that we've talked to a lot of manufacturers about in their marketing is understanding kind of the mentality of striped bass fishermen. I think that a lot of tackle manufacturers have an understanding of tarpon fishermen, say down in the southeast, that have a conservation ethos and want to release tarpon. They're not keeping them. So talking to them and how they do their marketing, how they do their social media, and realizing you can build a lot of goodwill with striper fishing in the Northeast now. It's changed very quickly from being a keep my 2 fish, my 4 fillets, or whatever the regulations are, to now, if you present your company and present yourself and your marketing to show that you care about striped bass conservation, it's good for the fishery, of course, but it can also be good for your brand and for what people think of you and the products you produce.
Sure. And I'll give some further advice. I mean, we see it when these big year classes come through and we keep them strong, fishing effort skyrockets. If the stock doubles, the fishing effort does not double, it quadruples. And they're all buying hooks and everything else. So it behooves everyone to keep the stock really healthy. The other thing is there's some next steps we're going to need to look at. Once we nail the circle hook question as well as we can, you know, we have to start looking at artificials. Maybe we don't want treble hooks on lures. If the cost of putting a single hook means you lose a fish now and again, but you save 10 million fish on the East Coast, that might be what we want to do. But we'll be doing some research on that in coming years too. But there's a whole lot of things that need to be done, research and promotion of there's a whole suite of ways we can pick away at this mortality problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Mike, and you guys have put quite a bit of resources towards some of these questions. You have ongoing research to try to get the efficacy of the circle hooks and that 9% release mortality rate that we've been using from the DO study.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We know the number's not 9%. It's 9% on average. Not to pick on Chesapeake Bay, but in August in Chesapeake Bay, it's probably 40% mortality. If you're fishing in 80-degree water with low oxygen, in the spring and full salinity, it's probably lower than 9. And the study we're doing will help refine that. But you know, we'll never get it perfect, but we can do better.
Perfect. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you for a robust discussion. I think there's a lot of good information that we talked about and also gave some good tips to our industry to try to help grapple with a fishery that's in need of some conservation and rebuilding. The circle hooks are obviously one piece of that puzzle and one that I felt like we could focus on as it directly relates to our industry and the different things that we do. So just in concluding, I'm gonna show my slide that shows my contact information. And I will be sure to also include both Kevin and Dr. Armstrong's contact info on the website for the seminar so that people tuning in can also follow up with them as well if they have any questions. But thank you, gentlemen, very much for a great discussion. And I look forward to being able to see you guys soon in person as opposed to webinar here, but I really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
awesome.
get back up
Thanks,
here.
Mike.